About a decade ago, Noah's Ark landed at my house. It was a Fisher-Price Little People playset, and it had already been cherished by somebody's kids, but it was so remarkably well made. As a matter of fact, I have a feeling that when the human race has sunk into the rising seas, this toy will still be in pretty good shape. And apparently the set was Noah and his bride, a couple of zebras, a couple of lions, turtles, rhinoceri. We acquired it in the South, and yet it didn't have any like brontosaurus, which was really surprising. And these storm-tossed refugee plastic creatures disembarked in our house, and they went exploring, and they sought their habitats in every room. Plus, the plastic boat had detachable parts which drifted into various areas from the basement to the attic. And every so often, we would round them all up for a reunion party so one of our kids could play with the set, and then they would quickly disperse again. They filled and subdued the promised land of our house, and apparently they were fruitful and multiplied. When we rounded them up for the last time, there were somehow 3 zebras. Well, last year it was time to pack them all back into the boat and bid them bon voyage at a thrift store drop-off so that they could journey on into someone else's house and populate it. Now, the flood is the most shocking horror story in the Bible, and it really has no business being a children's toy. The flood story was originally told as a horror story, not just a horror story, as a church fundraiser horror story. It comes from this old Sumerian tale about religious tax evasion. The Mesopotamian gods had created humans as farmers to feed them. And, the Mesopotamian gods, their diet consisted primarily of beer. They were raging alcoholics. As a matter of fact, that, if you went back to ancient Babylon and said, why do bad things happen to good people? They would have said, oh, that's an easy one, because the gods are drunks. Like, you don't need to fill up a whole library of theology books about it. Anyway, so the gods had created the humans to do this thing, and when the farmers went on strike, the gods punished them with this apocalyptic flood. The priesthood used this to terrorize the peasants into giving food and beer to the temples. And then the Israelite priesthood got a hold of this story. They liked it so much that they told it twice. And then the biblical editors couldn't decide which version they liked better, so they included both in the book of Genesis. But instead of putting them back to back, they interspersed the 2 stories line by line. So when you're reading the flood story in the Bible, everything happens twice, and it's got this kind of seasick quality. It happens twice with minor variations. For example, the command to gather the creatures 2 by 2 is immediately followed by the command to rescue 14 specimens of each quote-unquote clean creature and 2 of each quote-unquote unclean creature. And wow, the idea that God would even create creatures that God's self, would label unclean is a little bit disheartening. Then Noah builds this thing according to the Lord's specifications, which, if you read closely, are not instructions for a giant boat, but just a giant box. The ark is like this big shoebox. The Hebrew word ark just means box. So for the toy playset we had, actually, the box that it came in was more biblically accurate than the boat-shaped thing inside. And Noah worked on this thing, and here's one of the scariest things about the Bible story. Noah worked on this thing for years and didn't tell a soul what he was doing or warn anybody about what was about to happen. Now, in the Quran, the Noah story is told, And he actually builds it as slowly as he can to give him time to warn everyone in town. And the people refuse to listen. But in the Bible, he just builds it in grim silence. In his defense, the Bible does tell us that he was 600 years old at the time, which is kind of a crotchety age when trying to give advice to young whippersnappers. Seems pointless and exhausting. Whatever it was that humans did or didn't do to deserve this flood, the animals had to pay for it too. We read in the book of Genesis, all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and cattle, of beast, of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, all that was in the dry land, died. Now that's a scary story. And when this indignity was done to the poor animals, the surviving creatures had to face something even worse. When the ark landed, the Lord declared open season for hunting. In the book of Genesis, chapter 9, every moving thing that liveth on the earth shall be meat for you. This is the first biblical reference to humans eating meat. This is where it becomes pretty important that God told Noah to bring 7 breeding pairs of each edible animal. And Noah, if you haven't read the story in a while, when the work was done and the ship was landed, the first thing he did was plant the first vineyard, made wine, got drunk, passed out naked, and suffered the first hangover. Rabbinic legends tell us that Satan assisted him in this venture. They decided to go into the winemaking business together. So before Noah planted the vineyard, the devil sacrificed 4 animals on the spot, a lamb, a lion, a pig, and a monkey. And thus it was determined that the first cup of wine should make a person docile as a lamb. The second makes him loud as a lion. The third renders him filthy as a pig. And finally, the fourth makes him ridiculous as a monkey. Now, this episode is not in the Bible. It's a bit of old rabbinic humor, dark humor, with some cruelty to animals, especially since the pig, lion, and monkey are all considered, quote, unclean, and so Noah had only saved 2 of each of them. Our modern version of Noah's Ark is the local zoo. As the tide of human housing and landfills spreads and rises, flooding natural habitats with tourists and suburbs, we attempt to rescue animal species by putting reproductive pairs in boxes. But the animals don't get this for free. They must earn their living as entertainers, naked entertainers, which is ironic since we bring our children to point at pangolins on the catwalk, wolf whistling like construction workers to get their attention. Eventually, someone has to come along and say, you know, the buffalo zoo is not a natural habitat for elephants, which is a fact. But it's an antsy fact that inches us closer to the uncomfortable conclusion that the buffalo zoo is also not a natural habitat for buffalo, by which I mean bison. And somewhere in the haze lurks the inevitable logical conclusion, Buffalo, New York is also not a natural habitat for Buffalonians, by which I mean alcoholics. And no amount of Labatt Blue will ever change that, even if you print Zubaz on the cans. As a matter of fact, and don't shoot the messenger for this one, Labatt Blue does not keep humans warm. It only makes us less aware of the cold, which nonetheless is working on our bodies. So getting the zoo elephants drunk won't fix anything. Also, it takes a lot of alcohol. But I'll tell you this, believe it or not, but this is a biological fact. Elephants will remember where their favorite fruit rots at what time of year, and they will travel hundreds of miles to get there just in time. And when elephants get intoxicated, they make mating sounds, but not actually for the purpose of mating. So apparently drunk elephants tell dirty jokes in elephant language. I'm not kidding about this. In elephant language. Anyway, someone finally says, well, if buffalo's not a natural habitat for elephants, we will have to relocate them, because that's easier than getting an elephant into a hoodie and some sensible winter pants, by which I mean Zubaz. I'm just using elephants as an example. Actually, it would be a lot easier to get them into snowsuits than tigers, who think everything's a zipper that only goes one way. The Buffalo Zoo elephants were relocated 6 years ago to New Orleans, where they star in a permanent installation production of A Streetcar Named Desire. A natural choice because the call of the adult male elephant can only be translated into human speech as the cryptic word Stella. That may sound like a joke at first, but it's a biological fact. The lion, the chimpanzee, about 60% of the sounds of the jungle are just animals saying Stella. It means something like, baby, come back, I can change. But you know they can't, because nature is nurture. Behavior is biological. When I hear that animals are unhappy at the zoo, I definitely sympathize, since I live in an artificial primate habitat, a monkey house that nature never intended. We call it the grass menagerie. But like the zoo animals, I cannot leave the ark. I was raised there. I am an entertainer, and I don't know how to get my food any other way. Not just an entertainer in the sense that I'm struggling to entertain you right now, but every job I've ever had required clapping like a seal and balancing some metaphorical ball on my nose in the hope of someone giving me a fish. So the zoo animals are stuck in Noah's Ark, and so am I. There are numerous indigenous American flood stories. The ancient Mayans had a story in which the gods made humans to make food for them. And when the humans refused, the gods brought their skillets to life to bash their faces, sent jaguars to rip them apart, and then sent a flood to wash away the pieces. It's said that some of these early humans survived as monkeys with their faces permanently flattened by airborne frying pans. But then the gods had to start all over again, creating humans who would feed them with corn pancakes and the occasional warm beating heart. But when I think about indigenous American stories that compare with the biblical flood, the one that really comes to mind is sort of the opposite. It's a flood story in reverse. Among the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples of western New York, the beginning of the world was all water and darkness, no dry land. And the swirling birds looked up and saw something mysterious, a featherless biped, what we would call a human, falling toward the earth. The story doesn't tell us whether she even bothered trying to flap her arms. But nothing could slow her down. She was accelerating toward the center of the watery earth, and the birds may have also noticed that she had an egg-like lump in her belly. She was pregnant. So the birds, a bunch of loons as far as I know, they debated and consulted with each other, and they took a vote about what to do. And because they're Native American birds, they couldn't just vote and choose by majority. They had to keep voting and debating and voting until they reached a consensus. And they decided to help this creature, not by handing her an olive branch, which wouldn't have helped at all as a parachute, but by flying in a circular formation, each with a wing in the center, and thus they cooperatively formed a sort of basket or loony bin to slow this woman's fall. And then a friendly turtle surfaced to let the woman stand on her shell. Some of the animals swam up to see what the commotion was. Some dove down to see if there was anything under the water. And a muskrat brought up some dirt, which spread until the North American continent, or Turtle Island, was formed. The animals had rescued not just one person, but the mother whose offspring would start the human race. And this story is their story. It's not a tale of human heroes saving animals from manic depressive deities, with productive, destructive mood swings. The loons in this story are not messengers. They are politicians who must weigh out the consequences of fostering a displaced refugee who in this story is totally helpless entering this environment. And the muskrat who dives down heroically apparently drowns in the attempt. And they pick the dirt from its claw when it floats to the surface. Not to mention that the turtle is stuck there, a living ark, still bearing the animals above the water thousands of years later. I like that story. It's like a flood story, but it's a story where the animals save us. The biblical story of the flood, in my head I still call it the story of Noah's Ark. But really, it should be called the story of God's Ark, since the boat was God's idea. An idea about how to deal with the flood, which was also God's idea. An idea about how to deal with the wickedness of the world, which was also God's idea. And in that story, the most precious cargo is the seed population of the human race, which all descend from one guy. Noah, the character, is not good or bad. He just does what he's told. Actually, he never speaks in the entire story until the flood is past and he's hung over and he curses his grandson. Not his son who stumbled in and saw his nakedness, but his son's kid. Maybe his vision wasn't so good. He was 600 years old. Or maybe it's because all of the human survivors of the ark were relatives and all looked kind of the same. But that's not how biological survival works. Animals in pairs or 14s, or 9 related humans on a boat. That is not a viable seed population. The biblical story of the flood does not produce a biologically viable community, and it does not produce a socially viable community. There's one patriarch in the story. He gets drunk and curses 1/3 of the people. Nobody can argue. That's not a very happy ending. It takes more than a pair to make a family. It takes more than one family to make a community or a congregation. That's what makes a community and a congregation interesting, is the diversity of us. And doing our part to help save these fragile species, including our own, on this fragile planet, is something that's got to be done more than just 2 by 2. Thank you.